girls with their nails done. The girls with their nails done.
All right. And we are here with a very special episode of the Pig Show. Second round of the intro after screwing it up the first time. We are back after a long hiatus, and for a good reason. A couple of RTS legends who have been developing games for many years have formed Frost Giant Studios. Every RTS nerd out there is very excited about this because they've said, hey, we're forming a studio and it is going to make a AAA rated RTS game. It's going to be esports focused. It's going to really kind of, try and break a new mold while also harking back to a lot of the things that have made us love RTS games over the years. So I'm so excited that this is the dream that the two of you have had. We have Tim Campbell and Tim Morton, the co-founders of Frost Giant here. Thanks so much for joining me, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're glad to be here.
I think it's a very special thing where we've seen the game industry kind of change over the years a lot. We see a lot of kind of cycles where certain things get popular and everyone's jumping on it. It's I guess we see it in a lot of areas, right? In Hollywood, you've got, hey, we've got to make comic book superhero movies over and over. And with games, we see certain games kind of rise in popularity and dominate and be very popular and then fall out of popularity and come back. And for many years now, people have been saying RTS games are kind of struggling a little bit, or there aren't as many good releases. Where's the big releases? Think about the late 90s and the 2000s and how many were coming out. And I think it's really cool because you guys were involved in making quite a few of those games over the years. So, what are you guys' thoughts about this kind of view that RTS wasn't the most beloved genre of games over the last kind of 5 years or so?
I always look at the, I guess, relative audience for StarCraft 2, where, I was working on for the last 5 years. And those numbers have been so stable and so strong that my worldview is so different than others who are saying that RTS is in decline. It's just definitely there's a sense of other genres happening and becoming popular, and by comparison, I think people think that means that RTS is getting smaller, but it really has been incredibly stable. And we all know it didn't get any less fun, and there are so many people who still consider this their favorite genre.
Yeah, I'm far enough into my career and am old enough to have seen, I don't know how many, I've lost count, cycles of PiG gaming is dead and role-playing games are dead, and inevitably it's only dead until RPGs were only dead until Diablo came along and just kind of blew open the doors of what the genre could be. These trends come and go. It's easy to proclaim that something's dead, but like Tim was saying, the audience, the community, the numbers within RTS as a category are incredibly stable, and there's an incredibly loyal base there that does not really ebb and flow at all. And just because other things have come into existence and blown up in popularity doesn't take anything away from the RTS space or the audience size or what makes this category great.
I love hearing that from you guys because I'm always, streaming every day and this question comes up and I feel like a broken record saying the similar sort of things over and over. But I think one of the big eye-opening things was always looking at the player statistics for, of course, StarCraft over the years. And just the crazy thing which was always brought up is just like, hey, this is when, a cyberpunk style game came out, which the whole gaming world is like, oh my God, we've all been waiting for it. And you see the StarCraft player base barely change at all while every other game's population drops temporarily. And it's like this, oh, wow, it's got this deep relationship. And I think a lot of the RTS games have that deep history and that deep community. I was just going back and watching people still playing competitive Company of Heroes matches last week on YouTube and looking up some matches, a game which people say is dead. And there's still Age of Empires tournaments going on and all sorts of different games out there. So I think that's an interesting place to start, but I'd like to actually rewind a little bit and ask you guys just to give a little bit of backstory. I'd like to get more into Frost Giant and talking about that a bit later on if we can, but I know you guys are in the early days, and I'd love to just hear your thoughts about the philosophy on game design. I think a good place to start is to go right back to the beginning. And I was wondering if, Tim Campbell, you'd mind sharing kind of how you started getting into the games industry, or even before that, what games were you in love with growing up? Like, how did you get into this line of work way back in the day?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about it. I'm gonna officially date myself here, though, as the old guy here. But I grew up in the Apple II era. I grew up kind of early days of gaming there. A lot of pen and paper. Dungeons and Dragons was a huge influence on me, and the early days of strategy games becoming a thing. Um, it really hit me at kind of a key point personally in my development. I really imprinted on strategy games as really my favorite genre. Civilization on the turn-based side, and early the Dune games as they kind of morphed into strategy games, and then from there into early Command and Conquer and Warcraft 1 and 2, and just kind of on and on. And my appetite for that sort of game was voracious. So I kind of moved from one game to the next. And back in those days, there were lots of RTS games. Like there was a steady stream of them coming into the market. And so they just fed my appetite and kind of fueled my love for this type of game. And now releases are fewer and further between, and RTSs stay on the market for a lot longer. But I have a lot of different memories of all of the different types of gameplay that can fit within under the RTS umbrella. And my belief, kind of getting back to your first question before this, is I believe that the RTS space is primed and ready for sort of a renaissance for it, because there are so few companies making games in this space, and the few that are there are making games that stretch out for long periods of time. It leaves so much fertile design space there for teams to get creative with and to build something wonderful, and it's not choked off the way that other categories are. So I started in the early days and just immediately fostered a love for RTS gaming.
That's awesome. I did you study in university or college? Did you come from a secondary education, or was it straight from high school into that?
Yeah, I went to University of California at Irvine, and I didn't know at the time that Irvine was a hotbed for game development, and Interplay was there, and of course Blizzard was there, but Blizzard not the ginormous company that it is today. EA was there, all sorts of companies, and I fell into mid university. I fell into my first job through a friend of a friend. At a little startup, and video game degrees weren't a thing then. It was not my intended career path. In fact, it was kind of unthinkable to me at the time that it would be a career path. And I remember walking into my interview, and all I had to show really was my sweaty hands were clutching graph paper where I had mapped out my Dungeons and Dragons campaign and dungeons, my thinking about puzzles, and the stories I wanted to tell, and moved from there and fell directly into a level design role where I was able to kind of do the same sorts of things but do it digitally. And that just kind of blew my horizons wide open. It was mind blowing that I could actually get paid to do something like this, to do something fun like that. And very quickly, that job turned into another, and then next thing I know is my career.
That is awesome. Do you remember the name of the games you were working on back then? Is there anything that people might know from the very early days?
No, the first job I worked at was at a startup, and they didn't ship that game, and they're not around anymore. But I went from there to working at the Collective and then Westwood Studios. And at the time, Virgin Interactive, I worked at Virgin, and they were acquired by Westwood, and then Westwood was acquired by EA, and it became EA Business. So I worked for three different companies without changing my desk. I didn't literally didn't even move, and I just worked for this series of companies. And the exciting thing that did was it opened the door for me to work on my first RTS professionally. I was the first member on the what became the Red Alert 2 team, and that to this day is one of the most fun projects I've worked on, because it was just a chance to work on something I loved, and it was just a totally new team stepping into this genre, just all driven by a passion for RTS and trying to do something special there. And I had a blast working on that. So many lessons learned.
That's an awesome story. I love hearing about it, because the industry has just evolved at such a rapid pace, and to kind of see where people got their start and how they fell into it. And it's funny how so much of the history of it is entwined, and so many games designers have a background in things like Dungeons and Dragons, where there's so much literally unrestrained problem solving and creativity, which it's like the perfect playground to develop, I think, your way of creating problems and how to solve them in interesting ways.
I completely agree. I credit probably D&D and other role playing games like it, and the early moddable games. I was making Doom WAD files that I could play competitively, Duke Nukem 3D maps, Warcraft 2 maps, too many maps to count, and just those early experiences in D&D just really taught me by doing how to actually go through the creative process of seeing, hey, this thing seems neat, but it sucks. Here's how I can make it fun, right? And then just refining that loop. And that's professionally what we do as developers, because we try tons of things that suck. Even now, this deep in my career, so many of my ideas suck. And that's the first step, because we experiment, we try, we explore, we work our way through these ideas. Not all of them make the cut. In fact, many of them don't, but we ultimately wind up at a point where we've refined it to really these nuggets of really interesting features or fun mechanics or these moments that players can enjoy. And that creative process is one that really started from D&D and making dungeons and creating these worlds with people.
I always think that's a powerful thing when someone follows their nose and just kind of gets into something and is willing to experiment and fail. And it's often good if you're kind of falling into it at the start, because you don't have necessarily that much expectation of yourself. So you're not as afraid of screwing everything up. So you're willing to make some mistakes and fumble your way through and figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's oftentimes advice I give to people who want to make games is I encourage them to make games in whatever form that is. Make house rules for a board game you love. Change up understand why it works the way it works and why these changes you made for it are going to make it more fun, right? And if you can have that sort of conversation, then you're well on your way to mentally being able to approach game development from sort of that professional mindset of it's a process of trial and refinement and this iterative loop. And that's something that you don't need to be a video game developer. You don't need to have expensive software to develop. You just start from playing games, analyzing games, and figuring out how to make them better, and doing that in whatever form makes sense to you and whatever form you're passionate about.
And we are blessed now, I think, in 2020, there is such a range of single guys, or girls out there creating a game on their own, little indie game companies, right through to the huge teams on massive projects. But I mean, that's a great story to get some history, and I love hearing this. So Tim, I would love to hear how you got your start in the industry as well. And I mean, were you studying in college? Did you grow up playing D&D? What started it all for you?
Yeah, it's similar to other Tim. It feels like a long time ago, but I did come up at a different University of California, UC San Diego, studying computer science. And it's funny to think that at that point in time, I actually think I had an email address through the college, but the internet, it existed, but it wasn't really a thing. And World Wide Web and all these things that, we take for granted now, it was very different back then. CompuServe was a thing, for example, if you remember that. But anyway, studied computer science and finished the degree, and it was a very deliberate thing, kind of looking at what some of my fellow computer science grads were going off and doing and getting jobs at like HP and IBM, and I just had this vision of myself in a short sleeve dress shirt with the pocket protector, sitting in a cubicle working on something boring. And at the same time, there was a lot of talk about interactive television back then. I was thinking, oh, well, that's like games. Somebody's got to make content for interactive television. That sounds really interesting. And so I was interviewing at places like Time Warner had an interactive group, and I'd moved up to LA to get a job, and there was this ad in the classifieds for Activision. And I thought to myself, Activision, oh my God, like the hours I spent with Pitfall growing up, I want to work at Activision. That sounds amazing. And yeah, so literally just from a classified, I submitted my resume. I went in and they wound up hiring me for Return to Zork, which of course Zork the text adventure was something I had also grown up on. So it was a little fun sense of continuity to get to work on that as the first game that I worked on. But then on to MechWarrior 2, and that was about the time that Warcraft 2 came out, and people around the office at Activision were playing a lot of Warcraft 2. And I would kind of look over shoulders and think to myself, ooh, that looks scary. I mean, look at all those buttons on screen and all those units. I don't want to play that. It looks too intimidating. And at some point, somebody convinced me to try it. And it was a multiplayer game that I got completely destroyed in. And from that point forward, I had to redeem myself and really learn how to play the game. And I have just been hooked on RTS ever since.
That's the classic. I think there's two kinds of people. They get introduced that way. I think more often than not, they go, oh, geez, it's the same thing if you go to your, for me, my age as a kid, it would have been you go to your friend's house who has the Nintendo 64 you've never played, gives you a controller, and then just kills you repeatedly in 007 and laughs at you and doesn't give you a chance to win. And, and you'd be like, oh, really? This is it? And there's two kinds of people. The one who then figures out how to get them back, and then the ones who go, I'm never playing that again. That's really silly. So it's always good to hear it piqued your competitive side and grab the interest there. That's really cool as well. I like how you mentioned the text adventures was where you got started, the text games. It's crazy because if you try to explain a text-based game to someone who's under 20 years old now, their mind is blown. I mean, I think some people my age probably wouldn't even understand or have experienced it, where it's just like, oh no, it's it's basically Dungeons and Dragons on a computer, kind of is I guess the way to describe it. But I think there's something when you've got less of these flashy colors and pieces moving around and different mechanics in a game where it's just bare bones and you've got to be very thoughtful about what goes into it. And I think we're seeing a big appreciation for all sorts of games these days. I mean, for me, I'm so excited that the board game revolution has happened in the last 10 years. I have friends who are the least nerdy gamer type person that I would think of, and they pull out these super complicated board games when I'm over at their place now, and they're like, yeah, let's play a Scythe or a Terraforming Mars or something. And I'm like, you want to play this game? Like, this is really cool. I feel like it's gone from this niche spot where it was back then to a much bigger audience, but it all has its roots in the same sort of place. So was it something where when you guys told people where you worked, was there kickback? Were parents supportive? Were people like, what, you're designing video games? Obviously, like, there would be things that had been around with all sorts of arcades and everything for quite a while, but what was the attitude towards the industry back then?
For me, my parents were very supportive, but I did have to go through the process of explaining like video games, they're a thing, and this is not just a hobby. I've grown up, they've seen me play games, all sorts of games, spend all day in front of my computer playing games too much, right? Even going through first part of college, getting bad grades sometimes because I was too busy playing and didn't, perhaps didn't study enough. And so being able to explain to them and pivot that conversation from it being maybe a negative thing or a distraction to becoming a career that could actually sustain me going forward, that process took some working through. But no, they were super excited because they always really wanted my brothers and I to do things that we loved, and this was something that really connected with me, and so that was super good. But yeah, definitely those early days for me, explaining to friends or family members or answering questionnaires to people, going to the doctor's office, filling out that I'm a game developer, and have people look at me strange. What's a game developer? Like, you make Monopoly? Right? Like, they did not understand it.
You're like, oh yeah, I invented the get $200 when you go past go or something.
Exactly, that was me. Those chance cards.
I was lucky to have supportive parents as well. I think there were then, and still in certain corners there are now, I think, some negative attitudes towards games, like don't games make children violent, and are you teaching kids to shoot? And we all know games are so much more than that and do so many good things. There was even a study recently about positive impact that games have on people's lives and on people's development. But yeah, and there is always, I guess, a little bit of self-questioning of are we contributing the most that we can contribute? But I kind of reassure myself that at the end of the day, our job is to make people happy, and bringing more happiness to the world is a worthy cause, I believe.
Especially during times like this.
Yeah, it's the video game, the board game boom. I think more than anyone, there's a reason why everyone's playing Among Us. I think at the moment, in the last few months, we can get together remotely and have a laugh and have a good time. So that's cool to hear a little bit of backstory there, though. So after working on those text-based games, can you remember what the next few games were that you worked on from there, Tim Morton?
Oh, well, I should clarify that Return to Zork was actually a graphic adventure based on the universe of the original text game.
Right.
But yeah, MechWarrior 2 was the first game that I worked on in a meaningful way, because I came in very late in the process at Return to Zork. And that was a very formative experience for me. I think being part of helping to shape the vision and the features and the rest of that. It's such an old game now. There's probably not a lot of viewers or listeners who are familiar with it, but it was a great dev team. And I think beyond that, it found an audience. And that was a moment for me that I think really struck a chord in terms of understanding what was important to me about making games. And it is that, games that find an audience and have a community grow up around them. I think as a developer, you feel a bond with that community and you really want to continue to do the things that they want to see in the game and continue to want to make them especially happy. Anyhow, yeah, so Mech 2 and some more giant robot games after that. Yeah, just too many to list in terms of other genres and other types of games, I guess.
And where did that move into RTS for you? What was the first RTS that you'd ever worked on?
I didn't actually get to work on RTS until Command and Conquer Generals 2, which sadly did not release. There was an open alpha or open beta at some point, but it was later in my career that I got to work on my first RTS. And there is something wonderful about getting to work on your favorite genre, that finally your day job and what you enjoy line up. There's that little bit of fear that if I work on it, am I going to like it less? Is it gonna feel like work? And to a certain extent, I think maybe that's true for the specific game that you work on. Like by the time you've spent years trying to get a game out, you can get a little oversaturated with it. But the genre, like my love for the genre, never faded.
Yeah, that's it's kind of interesting where once you're so deep inside it for so long with a project like that, I imagine it's kind of like an author as well, where if they're writing a book, it's very hard to get any distance from it because they're so inside the story, and it's so important to kind of get an editor or someone to look at it. What I always find interesting about games is they're such a complex and creative process, but it's incredibly collaborative, and it's become more and more so as time has gone on. So the team sizes have grown massively. When you guys started out, how big were the teams roughly? I'm sure it varied, but like I'm imagining it was a lot smaller on each games you guys worked on in the beginning of the career.
Definitely. Yeah. Tim, you should probably answer first because I'm betting your team sizes were smallest. But
Maybe so, yeah. Early in game development, this is before my time. Like games could have been created by one or a couple people, right? Like they were very very focused creative endeavors. And when I started in the industry, teams were maybe in the teens, maybe 20-ish was a good team size. Like Red Alert 2 was not much larger than that. That was approximately where the team is. And today that would be a that'd be a teensy team, right? Like that's hard enough to make a prototype, let alone a full game. And as my career developed, the complexity of games, the standards, the amount of content, everything kind of shot through the roof, and so therefore, team sizes needed to increase as well. Also, the addition of more platforms. A lot of game projects are cross-platform, and so those bring additional people too. So it's been interesting to watch because alongside just the number increase that's happened, it's led to role changes as well too, where earlier in my career, developers were very really multidiscipline. Designers did all sorts of things, for example. And then over time, it's become more and more specialized. We're on the large teams now. You may have several different flavors of designers, each with their own specialty. And that's important for the big complex games of today to really hit the quality bar that we expect. But it's just been interesting to watch develop because it's not how the kind of my origin story started, where it started from a place of, hey, I can do a bunch of different things, so let me do a bunch of different things. And now it's more of really how do you perform best with a team and help the overall team perform really well.
Yeah, it sounds like similar sizes for me. I'm trying to think how big like MechWarrior 2 team was, for example, but it was probably when I joined it less than 20, and it grew a bit as it got towards launch. But now, I've worked on some teams that are over 100, but you hear about some of these projects like Red Dead Redemption 2 or Grand Theft Auto, where it's not even just one team; it's multiple studios, and there's 1,000 people, and just the scope of those games, it's amazing. It's maybe not from a creator's perspective the best experience to feel like such a small part of a big thing, but I mean, what they accomplished is absolutely amazing. So
Yeah, that's what's so incredible is it's, trying to lasso all these resources together to create such a big production. It's very, very difficult. And I'm fascinated by it when I hear about these huge games, like you mentioned, Red Dead Redemption. I've heard of a few others like Destiny and so on, having these absolutely huge development teams on them. And it to me, it's very interesting because I've got to imagine starting out on a smaller team in the early days, you're a bit more multidisciplined, you're not as specialized. It allows you to dip your toes in a few different ponds and learn how different things work. And you've probably got people you've worked with since then who are way more expert than you in each of the individual areas. But as your roles have developed and changed and you've moved more into directorial or kind of creative director and managerial roles, you're able to kind of use those skills from your past, right? Where you understand how the many pieces work together and you've got to try and harness all these different specialists and get them to work together. So was there any point where when you first kind of had to start working in bigger teams or trying to take on those different roles, was there any like really big challenges with that? Was some of the games maybe that didn't launch, was there ever a moment maybe before where you saw things go wrong? Like, what are some of the things you look out for, or how can you try to manage these projects as they get bigger and you've got so many different people working in different directions?
Tim may have different answers than I do there, but I think you touched on several really good things, and I think the way that you described kind of the maturation of the developer's role from generalist to specialized is something that I directly witnessed and completely agree with. And today there are definitely people who are way better than I am at many different disciplines that I work with, but especially in the game director role at this point, I draw on my generalist roots a lot in terms of helping me to be able to communicate with different people in different disciplines and understand the challenges they're facing and the workflows that they're going through, and to be able to just help set the team up for success. And I think talking to the larger team issue and how to coordinate people and deliver something great, I think there's a lot of different ways to approach it. But one of the fundamental things from my perspective is that you have to spend more time on the foundational vision and the consistency of that vision through development, so that everyone is clear on the pillars of the game, what you're shooting for, what the goals are, and they can themselves in their day-to-day work check what they're doing against those goals to make sure that they're in alignment and they're building towards the shared vision. So it's less me as the game director coming in and saying, hey, change this, change this, change this to stay on target, but more of the team becoming empowered and sharing in the vision to self-correct themselves and build as a group towards a collective vision.
Yeah, it's I mean, there's so much that we could talk about here because it's changed radically from and I think about those early projects, like there were maybe one or two people who worked on those projects, the early projects I worked on, that had ever shipped a game before. So it's like a bunch of guys, mostly just out of college, trying to figure out how to build a game. And yeah, you know, you think there's a lot more knowledge and science behind it, but the truth is it was just a lot of figuring it out together as we went along. And I distinctly remember at one point I got a chance to, this was before I worked at EA, but I was working in another company and we got to go inside EA under contract and do some work for them. I'm like, oh, I'm so excited. I'm finally going to get to see the right way to build games because these, I mean, they were huge at that point in time. We get in and it was like, it was basically certainly more experienced people, but just as much mayhem and, you know, problems that people didn't know how to solve. And they were just, they had the scale. And so they were able to overcome that. So yeah, it definitely as teams get bigger, the mayhem factor increases and communication gets harder. But you know, one thing that did happen over that time is the emergence of a discipline called production for games. And again, like there's no perfect science to it and stuff still goes wrong all the time. But you know, there is a specific role now on a game team that is meant to try to help structure the mayhem and coordinate larger teams as they grow. So that's I don't know, a little bit of the how the sausage is made behind the scenes, but there's so much that we could talk about there for sure.
Yeah, I like the phrase that you just used, structured mayhem, because game development is messy and imprecise, and it is it's hard to describe until you go through it yourself. But it is chaos, 100%. And really, the trick is controlling that chaos and trying to channel it in a direction that will result in you figuring out the things that you need to figure out to, you know, put a bow on a final product that that is fun to play and is really good. And I love that structured mayhem example because that is definitely game development.
I think that's so fascinating. You know, from the outside looking in, as someone who is an avid consumer of many games and has never really seen behind the curtain, it's just interesting to hear how these projects go down. I really like what you said, Tim Campbell. I like how I've always got to kind of say the last name here, the double Tim phenomena. About like being, you know, in a creative director role, you've kind of got to keep people focused on that vision, that shared vision. I like that term, shared vision, because I think that seems like it would be the biggest thing and something which is hard to put into place. But essentially, when you've got these big teams working on a creative project, I can imagine that there's so many moving pieces, there's so many things you can't foresee, right? So people need to be able to all adapt and make adjustments and move. And that's why I guess there's part of it which just is like, we need to make sure everyone, even the most, you know, whoever is at the bottom of the pyramid of the work, they have to still know where it's going so they can adapt throughout the day. And of course, corrections are needed, you know, obviously they happen, but it can definitely be, if I can imagine if you don't have a shared vision or if there's little discrepancies with the communication, things could fragment and fall apart very quickly. Have either of you ever worked on a project like that where you felt there was different shared visions being worked on at the same time? You know, there was one over here, or there was a lack of communication and things splintered, and because of that, whether the technology didn't come together or the design just was a bit kind of, it clashed and it didn't fit as one whole piece. Have there ever been any games that went off the rails because of that?
There have definitely been some games that went off the rails because of that exact thing. I've more come in the aftermath of those, I guess. I think some of the cancellations I worked on were for other reasons, but yes, that definitely happens. And you know, it's probably worth touching on that. starting a new studio during a pandemic, like one of the things that we're having to adapt and figure out is how do you develop shared vision when it's hard for us to all get in one room together? You know, collaborating through video chat works okay for a small group, but to get the whole team together and really have meaningful brainstorming sessions through video, it's just different. It is harder. So it's an important aspect of laying a foundation for a project, and so we're certainly trying to approach it thoughtfully. But yeah, it's there's not an easy answer to how you build shared vision.
Yeah, and building on that, also shared vision isn't something that we start with automatically at the start of the process. It's something we have to find through the hopefully early stages of development, where we take a bunch of people from different backgrounds, different companies, different games, and pulling them together and trying to get on one page. And that sometimes takes a period of time where you're really defining what the vision is and working through the details of that. And I imagine it's probably really simple if you're doing a really tightly defined sequel to something that already exists, and there are incremental changes, and you can really just say this is what we're building. But when you're trying to push boundaries, when you're trying to really advance something or do something that is significantly different, and there aren't a lot of things to point to anchor people's minds, you basically start with everybody already not on the same page. And you effectively have to go through this process of kind of negotiating your way through all the different ideas to get everybody onto the same page, and then really trying to preserve that shared vision through everybody contributing. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the games aren't built by one person. They're not designed by one person. You want everybody top to bottom in any department feeling like they can help creatively make this game better for people to play, make it a more fun experience. And you want the team pouring those thoughts and those ideas and those little touches into it. That's how you get amazing games. That's why Blizzard games, say designed by Blizzard Entertainment, and their games are amazingly polished, right? It is because they really do a great job of harnessing the whole team's ability to say, hey, no matter what my role is, I'm going to do my part to make this game better for people to play and make it more fun. And that's something that once you get that shared vision, it's really about supporting the team to then collectively make that a reality.
And we have this crazy idea with what we're working on right now, to not just have the vision reflect the thoughts of the team, but also to try to harness the thoughts and the input from the RTS community. And I say crazy because it's hard to find true north because you get a very broad variety of opinions. But at the same time, the input is just extremely valuable. And so we're kind of finding our way through the dark a little bit in what the best way is to do this, but we're trying to take advantage of a subreddit community on the Frost Giant subreddit. We've got a newsletter that we're using to kind of send out our thoughts and also pose questions to be discussed. And we're also trying to have just regular feedback loops with some of the more prominent folks who have been part of the RTS community, such as yourself, to get some direct feedback that way. But it's an extension of one of the Blizzard core values of every voice matters, that we really are trying to synthesize the best decisions based on feedback and based on input. So we'll see how it goes, but that's something we're trying to do.
Well, I can visualize this very clearly. So the two of you are on a raft and you're kind of paddling out into the tempest and internet, give us feedback. This giant waves and wind coming at you, and you're brave men. So good job on that. And I'm very happy to see, the whole team has been very, very open. The couple people I've been chatting to looking for that feedback. For anyone who's listening or watching the show, definitely do check those out. I've both put them in the Twitch chat. They're also in the description below the video or in the show notes. We've got a link to the Frost Giant subreddit as well as Tim's Twitter account. You've been putting out some tweets saying, mental checklist. What sort of units does everyone love? And it's cool to see that. I think it's a valuable thing where it's that balancing act of wading through and seeing what you find that resonates or what makes you think about a certain thing, because you're outsourcing creativity. And that's what's so great about social media and what you can use it for here is you can grab all these ideas. They're not all going to be great. That's what a brainstorming session is. Some of them might be crazy. Sometimes when you're sitting around a desk with a bunch of teammates, you're going to throw out some crazy ideas. It's part of the process. But I love the way, the community, I think, can influence things, and they sometimes come out with a brilliant idea. Sometimes I read a YouTube comment or something in some corner of the internet and I think, oh, that's insane. And then like 2 days later, I'm thinking about it and I'm like, you know what? Maybe that a unit could be designed like this, or an RTS could be designed in this different way. So definitely a call there for everyone to share your own input on what you guys love in RTS games and what you'd like to see. I've already read a few really interesting viewpoints, some which I was completely disagreed with, some which I was like, oh, that's brilliant. I hope you guys do that. And I'm kind of funneling those along whenever I get a chance, whenever I collect something that's really piques my interest. So yeah, good on you guys for trying to grab all of that feedback. So I like that idea, right? Obviously it's not, hey, I'm the guy who's making the game, or we're the two. This is our idea. Go make it, everybody. We're telling you how to make it. We're cracking the whip. Obviously, it's this collaborative process. You're trying to develop how you can form a game that you guys love, that the community will love, and that will evolve into this thing naturally. Has there ever been a point in a past project, and this is just an open question, where there's been a very drastic about shift in that vision partway through the project, and things kind of had to get scrapped and go in a different direction?
Many times, probably too many for Tim and I to list off here. But one example would be Warcraft 3. I was brought into Warcraft 3 in the middle of one of those transitions, where Warcraft 3, when it was announced, was more role-playing game, right? It was squad-based. Your vision was limited around where your people were. You couldn't just like free scroll around like a normal strategy game. It was an RPS, a role-playing strategy game, and I was brought in the middle of a pivot for that project that had the development shift to the model of gameplay that ultimately shipped, and everybody remembers when they think about Warcraft 3. But it had started out in a very, very different direction, and I wasn't there for those early days, so I can't really comment on the thinking or the process that went into that. But coming in at the pivot point, again, it was a moment of everybody not being on the same page, right? Because what was before is changing, and now some people want to emphasize this, some people want to emphasize this, and we went through a process of hearing all sorts of different ideas and encouraging people to be vocal, and then taking those things and kind of synthesizing together, cobbling those things together like Lego blocks into a new direction for the project. And that same sort of process that time played out internally at Blizzard, but that's the same sort of process that we're trying to go through now with asking the community for input and feedback and to discuss topics with us, is to really help generate those ideas that we can then use to piece together to make a better, stronger direction for the project. It's not that we don't know what type of game we're making. We're very clear about some things that we're doing, about our core vision, and we're not saying, hey, what genre are we making? Hey, should be turn-based or real time, right? Like, we know the general direction, but within that, there's a world of nuances, and there's a world of things that we could prioritize differently. And that's where getting the input from the community really helps us. It's in the same way that the pivot with Warcraft 3 did. At that point in the pivot, trees weren't even a resource at that point. And we had to ask ourselves, this is Blizzard's first 3D game. This is the first 3D RTS, certainly, that we've worked on. How do we do things that were easy in 2D that might be difficult now? And how do we get it to still feel like a Warcraft game through that transition? And it wasn't a clear path. We had to really put our heads together and work through that.
Yeah, big pivot for me would have been Generals 2, because we started that out as a traditional sort of, campaign box product, really, if you think of the old style of how RTSs were built. And midway through, we got redirected to make the game free to play. And suddenly, campaign didn't make sense in that context, and we had to focus on more open-ended gameplay modes, and that was a big change the team composition, change the approach pretty significantly. And ultimately, I think is one of the things that contributed to that product not actually getting launched, because making a shift that big just had lasting impacts on it.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. And what a pivot in the industry as a whole that was when free to play started becoming a model. A lot of the esports fans watching and listening all know about Heroes of New Earth, which kind of came out and it was free to play, and then they charged for it, and then they went back to free to play, and it kind of hemorrhaged its player base over these about faces after it was already quite successful as a game, trying to figure out how they were going to monetize it and communicate that. And there's been a lot of changes in that, but I mean that change, especially, I guess, a campaign RTS to trying to make that free to play. Was there any specific problem points with that? Do you think there was maybe was there a failing in the leadership to get people on the same creative page, or was it just the vision never really got found there with Generals 2 and it just didn't come together? Are there any specifics that come to mind that you see as a key to why it failed?
I mean, ultimately, the decision to release it or not release it was made at a higher level, so I can only speculate. But from the perspective that I had, I think the single biggest contributing factor was just leadership changes, and with leadership changes come strategy changes. When John Riccitiello left EA, John was a big supporter of free to play, and I think the management team that came in was more partial towards the traditional model that EA had followed for at least PC and console. And so since we had already pivoted over to free to play, trying to pivot back, we were too far down that road. But that was my perception anyway.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a big thing. I mean, everything, if the leadership changes, then suddenly it's a massive about face. So it's interesting to hear about that. Tim Campbell, are there any stories you can maybe think of where a game did fragment apart and kind of have similar issues, or did they mostly, find their way through? Are there any specific details or lessons you've learned from your own experiences when game developers been struggling?
Yeah, many. I can lose count on them, because game development is in many ways an act of faith, because you start off and you're building something that's not going to be playable for years potentially, and fun for maybe years after that, right? And so you have to kind of chart a course and project out and use your crystal balls and your best instincts and whatever market data you have, and say this thing's going to be good in so many years, and then it sucks for a long time. Games suck before they're fun, and you have to be able to work through that suck without kind of losing faith and saying, you know what, this sucks, let's change direction. Because every time there's a significant change of direction, whether it's changing engines midway through development, I've done that before. Man, you can lose 6 months, you can lose a year, you can lose longer of the team's momentum and effort just down the drain. Switching between PvE or PvP focus, I've gone through that switch as well too. And abilities that make sense for PvE with all sorts of stuns and things like that work well against monsters, you take that to PvP and suddenly it's a horrible mess. And so major pivots are things that you really have to really be wary of, and ideally you find a way to work through them without making giant changes like that, because that's really where a project can hit the rocks. And similar to Tim, I've many times in my career been brought in kind of at the point of something hitting the rocks, and then it's more about how do we kind of pull it off of those rocks, piece it together, and put it on a course for success. And it's a challenge sometimes to stay the course, especially as Tim's talking about, if executives change, if your champions change within a developer and publisher relationship, changes in a totally different company can trickle down in a big way that just fundamentally changes the project you're working on. And then as a developer, you have no choice but to kind of hang on tight and make the best of it.
Yeah, that's such I'm getting stressed out even thinking about it as someone at the head of one of these projects and all the pieces you're managing. And I mean, even just the sunk cost fallacy has got to be such a hard thing. I mean, with times like with Warcraft 3, where you said you came in after they'd made a big pivot, and that would have been such a scary decision to make because, like you said, every time you make one of these big changes, you lose so much.
Absolutely. And I have so much respect. Like I said, I came in during the pivot, but the decision had been made already. And I have so much respect for whoever went into that, because that could not have been easy. And ultimately, the end results speak for itself. And Warcraft 3 is a fantastic game. And so many times you can kind of see success stories like that out there in the industry. Looking at Fortnite, for example, the version of Fortnite that is incredibly popular and successful today is not really the focus of what Fortnite was when it launched. And there had to have been some gut check decisions going on there about pivoting the project. And pivots like that are an existential threat where the project, potentially sometimes companies, may not even survive if you go through there. And so I have incredible respect for the people who make that level of decisions, and ultimately they're making a decision that hopefully will lead to a better product, a more fun game, and something that's better for the community.
That's incredible. I think it's just, yeah, it's fascinating to think about all of this. And you mentioned Fortnite there, actually. So on a bit of a non sequitur, I mentioned Among Us earlier. We just mentioned Fortnite very briefly. I believe it was Tim Morton. I think you mentioned both of these just in a very one line in an interview that got quoted when the announcement came out. And I think it was kind of funny to see the a few, not a large part, but a small part of the community was very upset that you were talking about making RTS games and mentioning those games in the same sentence. So, oh, he's going to turn, it's just going to be this silly game. It's going to be all cartoony, free to play, running around building towers and shooting rocket launchers at each other and and trying to lie and pretend you're the alien or you're not the alien or whatever. I think obviously I like hearing when people are saying, look, I'm looking at all these different things people are enjoying right now and looking for any little piece that I can steal. A lot of creativity is taking little things that inspire you and working them into something different. You know, you take two things that have been done before, put them together in a different way, and that's great. So just a chance to clear the air, you know, were you going to recreate Fortnite essentially and Among Us as an RTS hybrid that makes no sense? Or
Let's see, when you put it that way, no, definitely not. Yeah, I think there are all kinds of cool mashup ideas around RTS, and that is just absolutely not what we're doing. We are trying to make something that carries RTS as we know it forward, and it is not going to be a left turn. It's not going to be a mashup of some other genre plus RTS. I'm sure there are inspiration from games that we've played that will find their way in, but just as Warcraft 3 led to the modern era of StarCraft 2, you know, we want what we build to be the next logical step for RTS.
Yeah, and just doubling down on that, looking at War 3, we were able to take something in Warcraft 2, and there were in the campaign mission some hero guys that were named, and you could kind of play with them in the missions, but they weren't really a thing. And in Warcraft 3, turned that into something which was a core within that game. And that was by us as developers not saying, hey, we want to copy this thing out there, because there wasn't really a game like Warcraft 3 at the time, but it was following our instincts about what's fun and what's fun within this RTS space and how can we make this interesting. And that was weaving an element into an RTS. It wasn't saying, let's take RTS and let's hybridize it with something else and let's make it into some sort of bastard child offspring that's totally different than either one of its parent genres. We are making a core RTS, and we're making it because we love core RTS. And within that, there's a bunch of design space that we think we can do some neat things that will really entertain people and be fun. But we're not approaching this as, hey, RTS is flawed. You know what we need to do? We need to dumb it down. We need to slice it in half, take out these dimensions, and ship something that was super simple, because you know what? Players are dumb and they won't be able to get this. We think that RTS, in kind of all its dense complexity, is a beautiful thing, and we love playing it. And we think that there are things we can do to that preserve that core that we love, but that will also be able to welcome more people to it. And that's the space that we're really developing the game within.
And what a tricky space it is, but an interesting one. And I like the philosophy of just following your nose on things that are fun. You're not necessarily just taking two rigid, separate ideas and trying to force them together. But I mean, I can remember in Warcraft 2, you know, as playing through that and going, wow, we're going to Draenor now. Oh, we get heroes in the expansion. Oh, cool. Beyond the Dark Portal. And okay, it's basically just extra hit points and a little bit of extra damage, but it was still cool having your little named units and you had to keep them alive in your missions. And when Warcraft 3 came out, it was so drastically different. I mean, obviously the 3D engine, and it looked great. People sometimes laugh at the graphics now. I was like, I don't think that game needed a remaster even. I could still play the classic graphics because it's done in such a style. But it was interesting to see, these units come out and you just had a little bit of item customizability, and all these units started to have more special abilities. You could throw nets with the raiders, and you started to have little spellcasters that could buff your other units and things. And I remember it being a very sudden change, but that has spawned entire genres of games now off of what that kind of brought into the space. And turns out the next logical step was, not only other RTS games that brought in hero units and inventories, but the entire MOBA genre obviously came out of that. And it was, it said, hey, these heroes are built well, this engine's built great. Let's go and hop in that direction, and look at how popular that is as well. So I like the idea that your minds are open about the next logical step, because it's hard to foresee what's going on. I think it was Brown Bear who wrote a nice little article. I'm not sure if either of you have read any of his stuff. He writes these little essays about RTS. And he basically wrote one after your announcement came out with Frost Giant, and it was just essentially saying, I've played a lot of RTS games. I love Age of Empires. I love StarCraft especially. But I found most RTS games that have come out over the last 10 years or 15 years have been kind of too much of a copy of the previous ones that were successful. They wanted to kind of be a Command and Conquer, be a StarCraft, be an Age of Empires, and they didn't necessarily do enough things differently or better. And it was just kind of, oh, it's that game, just slightly different setting or something like that. And he was really advocating in this essay, just saying, you know what, here's my wish. I hope the Frost Giant guys just get creative and follow their own vision and aren't just trying to create a Frankenstein of previous things that were successful, but, really want to inject their own vision into it and are creative and just make, I think it was, I want Frost Giant to make the game they want to make, was essentially what he said. And I like that message. And the thing is, at the same time, I'm not, on the other hand, averse to this idea of, you shouldn't take any community feedback. I think as long as it's done in terms of, hey, we're outsourcing some ideas and we're seeing what we like and we're picking up different things, but definitely trying to be willing to do that. And you've mentioned one of the core principles you guys seem to have already settled on is keep the complexity, don't dumb things down, don't be afraid of that aspect of RTS, which for the last 10 years everybody's been like, oh no, it's okay, this is an RTS game, it's a friendlier one, it's not, no, it won't punish you as much, come on, you can try it, like, trust me, it's more friendly, it's not like that StarCraft game where you got your butt kicked by your friend. I like that you're not trying to get rid of that. At the same time, I think some people are worried that it's very hard to introduce new players while also maintaining the hardcore integrity. And I don't think you guys would be deep enough to have necessarily solved this, but are there any other ideas or details that you can share at this very early stage as to how you can address that?
I'll start, and I think Tim will have a lot to add to this as well. But we talked a little bit about this on Pylon, but I think the gameplay experience at the highest levels of the game already, like today, without any sort of intentionality between making a different game for bronze players than for masters, grandmasters players, they're basically different games. Like the way a high-level player plays StarCraft versus the way a low-level plays StarCraft is radically different. And I think there are a lot of things that we can do both as an on-ramp for players, like having their first experience with RTS or they haven't played RTS in a long time, to make that experience better. And that's super important and doesn't take anything away from the high-skill parts of the game. But there's also thinking we can do deliberate now, intentional thinking about how we make that lower-level play a more accessible experience without changing the way that high-level players play the game at all. And so it's definitely a challenge. Like it intuitively feels like these things are at odds with each other, but I think that separation is already there. I think there's an opportunity for us to think about approaching that more intentionally. But Tim, what would you add to that?
Well, I think you did a great job of framing that up. I think our goal is to make RTS even more popular than it is today. We believe that this genre and this audience has a lot of room to grow. And the way to do that is not by trying to maneuver RTS and redesign RTS to kind of be a hybrid of MOBAs or something and move it over to a different genre, a different audience. But I think it's finding ways to bring those players who maybe have not gotten into RTSs before, or maybe got into RTSs and bounced out, finding ways for them to on ramp better into this experience, and maybe looking within the game at how players learn the ropes, how they move up, and how they become ultimately those really good competitive players that will be moving up the ladder and playing in tournaments and doing all that. And I think one of the advantages we have is, as a small studio that is solely focused on this and is building a new game and a new IP from the ground up, we can make decisions in different ways than a big company with an entrenched franchise that's had multiple iterations, and where you can't really change things because there are things embedded in this game experience that people will expect because it's a franchise. Like, they just whatever company, whether it's West with Command and Conquer, Blizzard with Warcraft and Starcraft, like there becomes a rigidity to franchises just because of their popularity and their success. You can't just radically innovate there. And especially with how long today RTSs are on the market, if you look back in like StarCraft 2, for example, Wings of Liberty shipped as a boxed product, right? Like that, it was a very different time, a long time ago. Like, it's been many years, and a lot of design decisions were made back in that different era and are still holding true through StarCraft 2 now. And so for us, the opportunity as a small focused company to be able to make fresh decisions today with all of the learnings we've had and with our understanding of the market today and make decisions, I think that there's a lot of opportunity there to accomplish what we're talking about. I don't think the two things have to be at odds. I think we can make a core experience that is dense and good and has the high skill cap and is something that people can play for years or decades and have it be a phenomenally long-term successful service, but also bring new players into it, which will make the overall ecosystem healthier for everyone involved. And I think we can do both of those things. But I think it's something that you'll really need to see from a dedicated group building something new without the constraints of legacy on it.
Yeah, we live in the age of, everything old is new again, and we need to have our 37th Iron Man movie and our 17th Call of Duty game, and it's like,
Don't
yeah.
get me wrong. There's a place for that. Many things I love are deep sequels. I can't. Civilization, for example, like that's one of my vices. I have sunk thousands, no joke, thousands of hours into the various Civilization games over their time, and they're deep in sequels, and there's a lot of similarity from one to the next, but I can't get enough of that. For example, I love it, but I think building a new Civilization is fundamentally different than saying, hey, we're going to build a new strategy game from scratch and be able to really open up the design space and get creative with it, because it's Civilization. There's a lot of constraints that come along with that, and that's not a knock against them. It's just the reality of a mature intellectual property that you have and a franchise that you have. And the opportunity here is to really make some new decisions within this space to marry those two main goals that we have.
That's definitely. I mean, there's mad respect for all of those sequels, but yeah, it is breaking new ground. It's exciting. It's dangerous. There's less. There's no path to guide you, so you're kind of beating your own path, which is always exciting. So
scary. It's for sure scary.
I love art. I love creative expression, and I think games are probably the favorite art form that I consume every day. And I think that's exactly what you guys are doing. Maybe not everyone sees it that way, but it definitely is this fascinating creative process, and it's really cool. So I think that's interesting. Onboarding, I think, is so huge and something which has been missed for so long in games these days, where every game is designed with a really nice welcome to the game. Usually, your opening stage of any type of game I play has these lovely tutorial stages that show you all the different mechanics. And when has RTS ever really had that in a really fully fledged manner? Definitely, it's gotten better in recent iterations. For instance, Legacy of the Void brought some things in, but there's always been a lack of that, and there's always been, a lack of focus on more accessible modes, less competitive modes as well. And I think that needs to be in every game. I'm a big fan of like the Spike Rush in Valorant, or the gun game in Counter-Strike, or I would love there to be like in an RTS game where you could just click a mode and it's maximum like 10 minutes, usually about 5 minutes, and you play a little micro map against other people who've also queued for 5 minutes. And if you then, your phone rings or your baby cries and you walk away, it doesn't matter. There's no ranking system, or not much. No one really cares. But that's something where you can still have the exact same mechanics as is in the competitive game that you're going to watch the absolute gods, the competitive pros using, but you get to do it without having to worry about the 1,000 other things that can come into an RTS match. So I love the idea of just creating those things which can keep you hooked as a fan and a regular player. And I think co-op did a lot of that with StarCraft 2.
Yep,
And a few other modes.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a big space, a big area to kind of innovate in that we see, and we're talking about different ways of approaching it. I mean, the old school way of approaching it was, play the campaign, right? And the campaign will gradually introduce new units, and so by the end of it, you'll know everything, and you can just move right into competitive play, right? And we all know that's not how you get into competitive play, at least in a good sense, right? Like those two things do not dovetail nicely, and so we want to approach campaigns in a different way that will disconnect them as a not very effective learning tool for multiplayer, and kind of approach them as their own mode with their own values and their own experience that they're going to provide, and then look at things, whether it's co-op or other things, where we can get people into a mode playing with other players, but maybe not in an intimidating, I'm gonna die to a rush in 5 minutes sort of mode, and get them familiar with that, and then kind of be able to get them to experience the game in a way that is not immediately intimidating, but that still gives them the headroom to grow into being able to play competitively and have those other sorts of experiences that we all love about RTSs.
And Tim is touching on something that I think is important for all of us to remind ourselves from time to time, that not everybody plays RTS the same way. And it's not fair to say that they're completely separate audiences. There's overlap, but there are a lot of players who really just enjoy playing against the AI, whether that's in a campaign or it's in co-op mode or it's in a custom. But that's a legitimate way to play RTS. And I think the audience that is perhaps the most vocal is the audience that loves competitive. And they're tremendously important to us also. Like clearly that audience has kept StarCraft as a scene and as a community going, and has cultivated this incredible esports scene. Like there are so many wonderful things about the competitive audience, but they're actually the minority audience. There are more players who play campaign than there are that play competitive. And both those audiences matter to us. Instead, like Tim said, instead of trying to conflate the two and imagine that everybody just transitions from one thing to the other thing, I think it's healthy for all of us to accept that it's okay to play the game that you want to play it. And if it's not everybody migrating to competitive, that's fine. The people who love competitive should get a great game, and we should also build a great game for other players. And it does create a burden for us to build more than one way to play the game, but the truth is that's already there in Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2 and Brood War and all of these great RTSs. So we're just kind of embracing that there are different player segments.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I think makes sense to a lot of people. I'm always surprised that there are so many people who've only played the multiplayer of these sort of games. Think of my fellow StarCraft commentators, a Rotterdam or an Artosis, who have never played the campaign. I think Artosis was just playing Legacy of the Void for the first time the other day and had never played Wings of Liberty or anything until like recently. He doesn't know who any of the characters are. He thinks Raynor is a young Italian pro gamer, not a character in the game. Or it's this funny thing, and it's something it was always the campaign in the early days, and I remember getting on the dial-up and taking the phone off the hook to play, Red Alert or Warcraft 2 against the friends, and I remember playing Warcraft 3 for the first time, and my second footman, or I think maybe my first footman, popped out, and there was 3 huntress and a demon hunter running circles around my base, killing everything. And I was like, "Whoa, is this what the multiplayer button does?" Okay, this is brutal. I don't think many people definitely gravitate to that sort of experience. I'm one of the few people, I think, who then goes, "Oh, let's play again," and maybe play some team games to figure some stuff out first. But for a lot of people, it was never that. Even back in the heyday of RTS games, internet cafes were very, very popular. When I was starting high school, so I was about 13 years old, around the early 2000s, and we always went to the internet cafe and played games, and it was very hard to find anyone to play a StarCraft, Brood War, or Warcraft 3 match against. When Dota got popular, everyone played Dota, everyone would play Counter-Strike, but RTS games, most people, they'd queue onto a game with a friend or a ladder, they'd have that experience of getting rushed once or twice, and they'd go, "Ooh, okay, maybe I'll play a tower defense." So I think there's a big thing to be said where people forget, where they go, "Oh, no, RTS used to be popular and now it's not popular." And it's like, the whole industry has grown and changed and blossomed. And I like the vision you guys have where you're like, well, RTS has just not kept up in terms of popularity while everything else has exploded. And what you're looking to do essentially is, hey, let's add that growth to RTS. I still have people message me through social media or send an email or a message in the Twitch chat on a daily basis who go, "I can't believe I didn't know about this game. I've been a competitive gamer for years. I love playing Counter-Strike or this other game. Like, how did I not know that there is a game as good as StarCraft out here?" And you hear people have the same experience with an Age of Empires or something else like that. And it is because it hasn't had the onboarding, it hasn't had the welcoming experience or necessarily the transference from campaign player over to that competitive side of things. So I think it's an incredibly ambitious goal to try and bridge that gap, but I have faith in you guys, so I'm excited to see where the ball lands on this one and see some of the ideas. I'd kill to be a fly on the wall in some of your meetings and hear some of those processes. So hopefully get a chance to hear a little bit as you guys go out. I know there's a lot of fans as well who are very keen, who've already signed up for that newsletter. That's just on the Frost Giant landing page, I believe. There's a big subscribe button for anyone who wants to get those updates. If you just give Frost Giant a Google, it will be the first thing that comes up. And that should be fantastic. So this is a big project. Are there any details in the last month or so since the Pylon show? Is there anything you guys are willing to share? I know it's putting you on the spot and there's not much. You guys are going to be a little secretive, but are there any lore or setting wise, anything to do? I've had a few questions. People are saying, have you guys settled on an engine, which I imagine is nowhere near just yet, but is there any details we can share since the Pylon show?
Let's see. We can talk a little bit about thought process, at least. Like we're not at a point where we've made hard decisions, but we're definitely at a point where we're thinking about what are the criteria that matter to us. Setting, I think we've probably talked a little bit about this in the past, but it's important to us that our setting feels distinctive and doesn't get confused with any games that have come before. So we're putting a lot of thought into how to approach that and make it exciting and fresh for everybody who's playing the game. I think on the technology front, we're doing some evaluations and some prototyping. There are pros and cons to all the choices. And really for us, I think one of the things that we're going to have to overcome, whatever engine we go with, is just most of these engines are not designed for the sort of high unit count gameplay that RTS requires. And as much as there are some games with a lot of players in them running on these engines, it's nowhere near the numbers that RTS games need. So there's a certain amount of technology work that we're going to have to develop ourselves. There's a very important aspect of StarCraft 2 being responsive and feeling great that doesn't come for free with any of these engines. Like there's work that we're going to have to do ourselves. So we're not at a point where we can say our setting is X or our engine is Y yet, but we're defining what matters to us and really trying to make decisions on the basis of those things. I don't know, Tim C, if there's more you want to add to that.
No, I think that's great. We'll be basing our game off of an established engine that's out there. I mean, both Unity and Unreal are common choices. We're looking at them and evaluating things. But Tim's right in that for RTS especially, there's a whole bunch of proprietary technology that's custom to RTS that's different than other genres that we have to build upon whatever base is settled upon, and that technology is stuff that we're working on now. This is the earliest I've ever had a network engineer working on a brand new project, for example. And I mean, just as one example, because network model and pathfinding and performance in high unit count games is so uniquely specialized that we want to make sure all of the decisions we're making right now and the fundamental technology choices we're making are going to be made from the perspective of supporting that style gameplay. And so we're trying to make the right early decisions to make sure to support the type of game that we're shooting to make. For example, we're already working on editor functionality for how to really go about creating maps and making map making a fun experience. Now we have a long ways to go and we have to iterate through that, but the fact that we're at the outset trying to start tackling these sorts of issues is really a sign that we're committed to making the end result really, really good, because we're tackling these key things at the start and making sure that the end result will be really high quality and fun to use.
Fantastic. I think it's so cool to see that you're laying that groundwork. It's become very important in the last few years. We see a few different companies very much prioritizing latency and servers and that feel, like you mentioned, the responsivity of units. I think everybody's played some sort of grand strategy game, whether it be an RTS or not, where it was like, okay, guys, go over there, and everyone's kind of like, ooh, ooh, and they're kind of sliding around, or they're turning really slowly, and you're like, this is interesting. There's some things going on that make it feel a bit clunky. It's hard to get that smooth game feeling, but
absolutely.
It's hard to describe as well. Like, I've played shooter games that felt so crisp and flawless, and other ones where you just feel like the physics don't feel quite right. And it's something, as someone who's not on the games dev side at all, I never understand technically what the differences are. I know Scarlett had mentioned things like making sure the turn rate of units was usually pretty high to give that flexibility, and a few other players are mentioning things like that. But it's cool to see that you've got that as a big focus, because that really is the beauty of the RTS games that you can play over and over again. You know, I can go back through some of the clunkier campaigns and have a great time playing through a story mode, but they're never the games that hooked me in the long term, playing on a daily basis the way a StarCraft did or something like that. So the fluidity of the gameplay, that's something that's very, very important, and makes a huge difference. And I mean, we've all seen with StarCraft's engine and the fun as a streamer it is, trying to do an incredibly CPU intensive process of live streaming and running a game. If you play a 4v4, especially on a single core that it wants to melt down at every moment, that one core is working so hard. There's another core barely doing something, and all the other cores in your processor are kind of sitting there going, you guys sure we can't help it all? And nope, they cannot. And 3 frames a second, giant armies kind of framing across the screen. You can't really see what's going on.
I think fluidity of gameplay is, like what you said there, is a really good way of summing up what our goals are for the feel of the game. You know, we aren't, deep in defining the pacing. Is it going to be as fast in combat resolution as something like SC2? Is it going to be, or where are we going to fall in terms of gameplay pacing? But the moment to moment feel of turn rates, and I'm clicking something and trying to issue an order, and the game just feels responsive, like it's just in sync with what I'm doing as a player and what I want it to do. It's hard to define that, and it's more than just a design decision to make our game fluid go. It's the collection of a lot of different under the hood decisions and a lot of work on the engineering side to make sure that we're approaching this from the right perspective with the right foundational decisions to support that end goal, so that years from now we will have a game that has that magic feeling to it. And it's one of the things that Blizzard has always done phenomenally well with their games, and we really respect that. And with our engineering team having come from SC2, like they know it, they love it, and we're really looking to recreate that same sort of moment to moment feel for people who are playing the game.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we go back a little bit as well to talk about making it a fun experience and trying to avoid the brutal welcome. Part of it was onboarding. Part of it was, well, how can you just make the gameplay for those lower levels, that different type of StarCraft that is played, a little bit less punishing. Do the two of you or the rest of the team think about it in terms of identifying specific problem points and minimizing the ones that you can kind of remove without impacting that higher end of play? Is it kind of identifying those and then working backwards from there? Or is there a different kind of philosophy to trying to take away the brutality of RTS competition?
I think there are multiple approaches that we're taking to look for opportunities to make changes that are positive changes instead of changes that take anything away. What we did do one exercise, we're doing a lot of deconstruction. So like a deconstruction of things that trigger negative feelings, for example, and sense of being disoriented or overwhelmed, stressed. And a certain amount of stress is healthy, but like RTS in particular can, especially in a brand new player, trigger stress feelings that probably exceed their happiness levels. So anyhow, we've done a lot of deconstruction to try to think about what are the contributors to those feelings, and are there ways that we can mitigate them that don't water down the high skill play experience. So we're trying to be very deliberate about how we approach those things, and it's not going to be any one thing. Like it really is a collection of a lot of decisions and a lot of refinements that we believe can contribute to a better play experience. I don't know, Tim, there's probably a lot of color you could add there.
Completely agree. There's not one button we can push to do this, one feature we can add, or one magic ingredient that's been missing in RTS that needs to be there for suddenly, this to happen. Otherwise somebody would have done that a long time ago, right? I think what Tim is talking about in terms of it being a collection of a lot of different incremental decisions along the way, kind of oriented towards the values and the goals we're talking about, that in aggregate, the totality of those decisions is going to be a sea change in terms of the ability for new players to on-ramp into a core RTS experience. And from the outset, we pay most attention to the emotional reactions, the things we love or the things that we hate about these experiences, because really game design and making products that people care about, it comes down to making emotional reactions in players at a gut level. And the things that we love, we're trying to deconstruct and find out, why do these work so well? Why do these things really generate the emotions that we want? Why do they make us want to keep playing? And on the other side, like Tim's saying, let's deconstruct why I just want to flip my table and rage, right? Like why I want to just quit and walk away and never play this game again, uninstall, right? Like we need to understand those emotions. And so we try to put ourselves in the headspace of players experiencing those, deconstruct why that's happening, and then learn from that, and then try to weave those learnings into how we design the new game. And that's part of why the community at large being able to help give us these insights is just a huge aid to us in development. Is we're a small team in the single digits, right? So our experiences, we've all played the same game, we all play SE2 and love SE2, but we all just have fundamentally different views of it just because of our experiences, and we do not have a holistic complete view the way that the community at large does. And so getting the community to weigh in on the things that they hate or that they love, and trying to dig into those and find out why, what aspect of it is something that I hate or that I love. Like the more we can do that, the more it helps us build a game that will really resonate with people at that gut level.
You mentioned Heroes of New Earth earlier, and just emergence of MOBA as a genre. I think it's super interesting to look at the evolution from Dota to Han into League and everything that followed with Dota 2 with Heroes of the Storm, and ultimately, it's hard to point to a single thing that took MOBA from a genre that had a core following. Kind of RTS has its core following. But absolutely, the original Defense of the Ancients had a core following, but the number of players that Riot's been able to reach with League of Legends is just orders of magnitude bigger. And it was such a large collection of changes. And I think there is absolutely still a core audience there that feels like it's stayed true to the roots of what a MOBA is, and yet it has been able to reach this much broader audience. I'm hoping, and there are lots of other examples like EverQuest to WoW, Magic Online to Hearthstone. There's so many things where there was greatness that found a bigger audience through a collection of user experience changes that made the game better.
And you've got to be brave to do that, because I know every hardcore gamer's attitude towards League of Legends for the first few years, which was, this is Dota for noobs. It's bad. It's not good. You can't even deny. I remember playing it for the first time. I kept trying to kill my own guys to deny the experience and gold, but they removed that. They said, look, when you're outskilled by someone, you get completely shut out of the game in Dota. That's what happens. You don't get experience. You don't get gold. You get destroyed. You get your face pummeled into the ground. And League said, we can take that out and still make it a super team-based, organizational-based. There's skill shots. There are still cool things, but we softened a few mechanics and we changed a few things. And for years, I mean, and there's still people today who'll be like, oh, it's a silly game. It's bad. But look at what League of Legends has done, and that is undeniable. There is a huge esports scene. There are a lot of incredibly high-level gamers who have made careers off of that game. So it I think is my reminder to distrust myself, because I was one of those people. I was like, this is a silly game, I was just as elitist as everybody else, but I think I was a bit cocky, and I think we clutch to the old things that we know sometimes.
Yeah, and thanks to League of Legends too, it's not just their game in that category that has done well. The entire category got bigger and stronger, and other publishers and other developers were able to make other games that also are doing phenomenally well. And in the entire category, I mean, it's not, you can't really call it a resurgence because it was a new category at the time, but it experienced phenomenal growth, right? And not just because of one game, but the opportunities that one game opened up. And really for us at the core root of why we're even doing this, because we love RTS. And this is, of course, something that we want our game to be a phenomenal game and to be incredibly successful. But at a gut level, as players and as fans, we want RTS as a category, as a genre, to flourish. We want it to become bigger and more varied and more popular than it is today. And I think that it has all of the potential to do that. And hopefully the game that we're developing contributes in some way to that coming about.
You touched on something though that I think is a fear of ours, and it's probably unavoidable, but it's anytime there's any change, there's going to be reaction to that change. And so the first topic that we presented was around heroes and RTS, which is actually especially relevant to the MOBA discussion. And we've gotten such a diverse set of opinions back, and it's been super helpful for us. At some point, we're going to decide either to experiment with heroes or not to experiment with heroes. But every decision that we make along the way, there's going to be some segment of the audience that feels like it was a bad decision. And we have to, constantly question ourselves. Are we making the best decision that we can make here? But we also have to just accept that we're going to try some things, and we have the benefit of some time to figure this stuff out. But ultimately, we want to bring the audience along for the ride with us. And we hope that they'll be circumspect as we're trying to be, and as it sounds like you now are about League. But I'm sure there'll be some moments along the way where we try stuff, and that there'll be some differences in opinions in the community, and so we're sort of mentally preparing ourselves for that, because there's no way to make everybody happy. It's just impossible, and we're going to try our best to make the broadest cross section of people happy that we possibly can.
Yeah, it's very easy, I think, to make everybody happy. You just need to make the most bland, flavorless thing in the world. So we're talking about something we want people to love, and yeah, that's it. You've got to. There's always going to be some people who kick back, and StarCraft 2 has a huge audience and huge people who's welcomed it after years of saying you're going to let them select multiple buildings, unlimited control groups. These things are going to break the game. It's too much. It's too crazy. And I sometimes have the same thing when I think about a future game. I'm like, oh no, like you couldn't change a mechanic. Like actually, just spitballing. And obviously, this is not asking for what you guys are going to do, but just kind of brainstorming. Did you play Total Annihilation at all with the super zoomed out camera? And like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I think that's really interesting. Because like I play Company of Heroes a bit, and I like you can semi zoom out, not as much as that, but it's way more than StarCraft, and it gives you a bit more of an overview of the terrain, and you can kind of it's very very much setting up in certain areas, and you get a bit more of a picture of the tactics going on without being a fast player, right? Whereas one of the most interesting mechanics in StarCraft, and also one of the most brutal, is you're so zoomed in that is a resource, is what you're looking at. Screens per minute rather than actions per minute is sometimes what people talk about. And one of the most common things is you distract here so they're not looking when the other thing goes in. You'll look at pro gamers, they're constantly doing it where they're hit here, then here, so this one lands. These two are the distractions, or it's pretend this is the attack, bam. Oh, actually, it was the big attack. The other one was the fake out. And there's constantly pulling each other's attention around. There is these little maneuvers people do, which shouldn't work. You're like, that shouldn't work. I try that. It never works. And it's like, because you're doing that in isolation, but you piece that together with X, Y, Z, bam, your opponent's brain is overloaded. Their minimap is covered in alerts and they miss it. And the mineral line of workers is gone. But if you zoom things out, you take that out, which is an interesting mechanic, but it's also a very punishing mechanic. And it's something the lower end, I think, absolutely abhor generally. They're like, come on. They're always walking into a corner up against a cliff because they don't even have a kind of sense of where the terrain is, and they're getting their army clumped up on a ramp, and they're not realizing when something's just off screen, killing all their stuff. So have you guys thought about the zoom out at all in terms of games? What are you guys' thoughts on it? Did you enjoy those Total Annihilation games?
I did, but I think every game's got different pluses and minuses to it. So it really, this is a great one to bring up. It's not one that we've actually delved into yet. It's definitely on the list, but I can totally see this as a future topic to open up, on the subreddit for feedback as well. I played a lot of They Are Billions recently, and it supports a further zoom than Star 2 does, and it is disorienting going into games where like the maximum zoom is so different because you get used to it one way. But yeah, definitely pros and cons to each. I think we need to talk about it as a team. I'm interested to hear that you prefer the further zoom, it sounds like.
I love the way it is, but I'm trying to force myself to be open to change. I'm so set in my ways that I'm like, maybe it is a good thing. And I've heard a lot of people say, I hear a lot of community, some people saying, oh, I would love to be able to zoom out a bit. So it's interesting.
Yeah, that's something we'll definitely look at. I loved Total Annihilation and Supreme Commander and those games and the scale that they offered. Really, again, it's a great example of broadening the genre and what the genre includes in terms of game styles and everything. And I think zooming out was critical. I think being able to zoom out as far as they do and then zoom into different places as a control mechanism, as opposed to just panning the screen, is I don't know. I think it's a big secret to how they were able to pull off that scale of game. So no, I love that. And we play every RTS, or we try to, at least we aspire to play every RTS that comes out, and to constantly be refreshing our knowledge of what experiences are out there and what we like and don't like, and how they make us feel as players. And what you're talking about like, I feel too close in or too constricted or things like that, that's the type of thing that we will get into. We haven't yet, but it's the type of experience that we definitely want to deconstruct and make sure, is that something that adds more than it adds more good than it does in negative experiences, or vice versa, and what's the right way to address it?
It's good to hear you guys are casting a wide net. They Are Billions was probably my number one airplane. Living in Australia, lots of 14, 18-hour, flights, 35-hour transits. Oof, I'll tell you, it's a great game. Bet They Are Billions. I loved it. I'll tell you, when you're playing on that little screen on a plane, though, boy, is it easy to miss.
Yeah.
One zombie gets into your tents, and not again.
And there goes an hour of gameplay, right?
Or 3, yeah.
Yeah, no, it is punishing in a way that I love, and I remember from the games that I was growing up, because games, to me, like, nostalgic lenses looking back, I think used to be way more punishing than they are today. And it's interesting to see a modern game that's made with that degree of just fragility in the game experience, where you can think all of this time, do everything perfect, and this one dude sneaks in, and it's just downhill from there. It all just falls apart, right?
Pure love hate. It's the Flappy Bird of RTS.
We love it. We've played a ton of that game.
That's cool to hear. Well, thank you very much, guys. I think we can round up there. Was there any other topics you guys wanted to touch on? You've already borrowed a lot of your time, but was there any topics that we hadn't covered that you guys wanted to talk about?
Maybe just to say thanks, not just to you, definitely to you for having us on tonight, and for your support since we've announced the studio, but also to the whole community, everybody else, from prominent figures at your level to just players who are engaging with us on the subreddit. It's really meaningful to us and inspiring for us as a team, and we're super grateful.
Absolutely. It's really, when we kind of set out to do this, we thought to ourselves that, hey, this is a good idea. Hey, we think that people will embrace this. And our investors agreed, and we definitely are setting out on the basis of what we think is good information, but it's always kind of a gut check to see how things will go with the community. And I have shipped a ton of games, and it's always just nerves and butterflies before announcements and before releases, right? It just always is, even if you're sitting on something that's golden and is good. And with this announcement, we really just wanted to do something that the community would love. Like, this is something where our goal is like crystal clear to us, and the response has been phenomenal. The response has been greater and stronger and more enthusiastic than even our best case scenario going into this. We've been blown away by it. So yes, please continue to engage with our anything where we're asking for ideas on things that we're not asking about. If you guys just want to discuss, and like, we see this, we are actively on the different platforms and just trying our best to gain as much insight from what you guys are saying as possible. And please bear with us, because we are, like I said earlier, single digits in terms of people, very small team size. So our ability to actually be all places and responding to all threads is super limited, and we're just trying to make sure that we are engaging back as much as possible. But we love it, and we really appreciate the community, and thank you so much for all the support that you're giving us, and we want to build something that you guys are going to love for many years to come.
That's a beautiful sentiment and a great way to finish up. Thank you very much to both of the Tims for joining me here today. And everybody, I hope you've enjoyed the show. Please do scroll down below the YouTube video into the show notes and so on to get some links there to both follow the subreddit, follow Tim on Twitter, frostgiant.com as well. Tim Morton, is there any social media we can get you on yet, or are you still best to just go through the newsletter and the subreddit?
Yeah, I am on LinkedIn, but that's sort of more of a business network thing. I'm certainly paying close attention to what's going on the subreddit, and trying to help put together the newsletter every month.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, guys. Give them a follow. Go let them know your thoughts and help be part of this brainstorming session for what the next logical step in RTS will be. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a good night. We'll see you next time.